I'm not sick or struck dumb. Or don't you know a kick when you see one can't quit? We're not done. We're gonna kick till the next one. Hello, fine people, and welcome to The Kick. This is a theme, scheme, and movie podcast on the Now Playing Network. I'm Chance. Hello, hello. As you may or may not know, this show is organized in themed series, kicks, if you will, that end in the release of a new movie. And here we are, about to start the engine on a new series. The Bikeriders, starring Tom Hardy, Austin Butler, Jodie Comer, is out June 23rd. It's a stacked cast, a director in Jeff Nichols, who's always interested me. So I thought, let's spend the last days of spring exploring one of American cinema's great archetypes, the motorcycle rebel. And it's widely accepted that when it comes to movies, that archetype is born in 1953 on the broad shoulders, inimitable pout, and tilted cap of Marlon Brando in The Wild One. And there's no one I'd rather have on the show to talk about The Wild One than Burt Kearns. He is the author of a brand new book, Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel. He's also written books about Lawrence Tierney and a forthcoming one that sounds very exciting about Shep Howard. Maybe we can plug that more at the end. It's a super entertaining act of cultural history and analysis that kind of brings you through Brando's life and work at warp speed for the purposes of showing the ways in which he evolved acting, celebrity, activism, and rebellion, and set the stage for everything from the new Hollywood to punk to leather and much more. And in fact, the book uses The Wild One as something of a turnkey to analyze it all. But let's say hello to Burt. Burt, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be
Thanks.
here.
I appreciate it. When I ask you to do this, I must say, I assumed that you would write about The Wild One in the book. I did not know that it would be, arguably, the central movie discussed for kind of unlocking Brando. When did you know that that movie would occupy such a central place in your book?
Well, it came about because I have an issue, a problem with doing projects on cultural figures that most people have never heard of. People like Neil Innes, Lawrence Tierney, et cetera. And it came down talking to my agent. It was like, you've got to do a book about somebody that people have heard of. Well, why not just go
Sure.
to the top with Marlon Brando? And we saw that Marlon Brando's 100th birthday was coming up in April. And so we wrote the book. I wrote the book in time for that. And again, it was, what is there else to write about Marlon Brando? There have been so many books about Marlon Brando. He's got an autobiography. There's been 700-page books about him. Well, it came down to looking at what his cultural influence is 100 years after his birth, 20 years after his death, and seeing that it was pretty immense when you look at the influence that he continues to have today. And it all goes back to me growing up in the 1960s and the poster I had on my wall of Marlon Brando in The Wild One, right alongside Peter Fonda on his Captain America motorcycle with a red, white, and blue gas tank that I colored in with a magic marker or a crayon. And actually, they were black and white posters.
Yeah.
Seeing that this wasn't Brando's best film, it was his fifth film, but it really has turned out to be its most culturally significant.
Yeah, I feel like you're not the first person. There are so many other people in the book who were like, to them, The Wild One is a poster, really the imagery. So maybe we can start there. Why is that movie such a wellspring of iconography, even if it's not remembered as well as, say, 10 of his other movies when it comes to pure movie discussions?
Well, because it was that image of Brando on a motorcycle with that 8-panel mariner's cap and in that shot perfecto leather jacket. That became the ultimate image of the rebel from the time that movie came out. I mean, when the film came out, it was the first biker flick. But there were no biker flicks back then, and there was no youth market. This was a film that Brando and the producer, Stanley Kramer, thought was going to be a culturally significant message movie that was going to address issues, socially significant issues at the time. Well, the censors got their hands on it, et cetera, and pulled out all the stuff that they thought was important. And you wound up with this film about a motorcycle gang that comes to town, meets their rivals, trashes the town, runs off, and that's the end. And that's all you had is the chaos. Brando himself was very disappointed in that. The film was banned in certain countries. It was banned in Memphis, Tennessee, because they thought it would inspire juvenile delinquency. In the UK, there had been some very high profile murders involving youth gangs and other crimes, and they thought this would only inspire more. So the film was banned in the UK until 1968. But people saw it. It was shown in theater clubs in the UK. And of course, in every cinema magazine, there was the film, there was the image, and there was that image of Marlon Brando. It turned out that this film, coming out in 1953, inspired a youth revolution, a rock and roll revolution, although there was not a lick of rock and roll in the whole film. And they're speaking this jazz lingo that came from the streets and black jazz in the 1940s. They were really invaders into white society. And so they were picked up by the civil rights movement as well. So it turned out to have this incredible influence. And then as the 1950s moved into the 1960s and the 70s, it went on for their rock and roll, punk, Andy Warhol, art, the leather culture. I always say we have to thank the wild one for the leather man and the village people. We would never have had the leatherman if not for the wild one.
It's a culturally generous thing that it's given us.
Yeah.
Burt, I want to, for people that don't know the movie, and we're going to talk about it in depth, I'm going to bring them in here. You just did an excellent short synopsis, but here's my attempt. So it opens with a text crawl that says, "This is a shocking story," and they're saying this because the Wild One is loosely based on a famous incident of motorcycle hooliganism in small town California in 1947. Brando's character Johnny, captain of the Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, leads his 30-odd riders into a couple of California towns. We understand pretty quickly that this is like a nomadic band of riders who despise authority. They live for some rabble-rousing, and they careen into the town of Wrightsville and almost immediately get into a scrape with some locals. The town sheriff finds himself caught between the bikers and the business owners, and Johnny develops eyes for Kathy, played by Mary Murphy. She's the sheriff's daughter and the barkeep at seemingly the only cafe in town. And the day stretches on while the bikers are waiting for a member of their gang to receive some medical treatment. Johnny keeps making passes at Kathy. Kathy keeps turning him down, but in a sort of demure, interesting way that sort of betrays a young woman stuck in her town, dreaming of getting out. A rival gang, the Beatles, rolls into town. They're led by Chino, played by a young Lee Marvin, who clearly has a history with Johnny. We'll get into that. A brawl ensues, and the townspeople get angrier and angrier at the disorder. And then you've got something of a powder keg going, fueled by beer and vigilantism and misunderstanding and a war for the social fabric of Eisenhower's America.
It begins here for me on this road. How the whole mess happened, I don't know. But I know it couldn't happen again in a million years. Maybe I could have stopped it early. But once the trouble was on its way, I was just going with it. Mostly, I remember the girl. I can't explain it. Sad chick like that. But something changed in me. She got to me. Well, that's later anyway. This is where it begins for me. Right on this road.
And through it all, you got Brando, seen here at the crest of his early stardom, and he's the very picture of anti-heroism. He's internally tortured, but externally magnetic. He's scary, but sensitive. And the character of Johnny becomes this kind of fascinating, ambiguous mix of strong beliefs and also sort of lack thereof. We'll talk about how much of that is in the script and how much of that was censored out. But Burt, let's talk about just the opening shot, because this is where you start your book with the two-lane highway and the motorcyclist kind of rolling toward the camera, and then you just have this shot of Johnny, played by Brando, that is just like pure worship. It just holds on him forever and ever and ever. What do you make of that statement, and how did it differ, if it did, from like the traditional film grammar of the time?
Well, I think that everything that the censors and wanted the producers to put at the front of that movie was to say that this is a shocking story. It's a terrible thing that could never happen again in America. We don't, we don't know why it happened, but it happened and we let it happen, etc. The minute it switches from an actual shot on location of a brigade of motorcyclists careening toward the camera to a studio shot of Marlon Brando flanked by two bike riders in front of a rear projection screen, obviously a rear projection screen,
Right.
and just focusing on him, where it's a fetishistic look where you just get to watch him. You get to say, wow, this guy's got sideburns. This guy's got a leather jacket. Oh, look at what it says Johnny on the chest. Look how cool he is. He's got those Bausch and Lomb sunglasses on. Wow. And it's almost a glamour shot that in the 1950s they would reserve for a starlet or a woman. And everything that you may have been predisposed to be against these marauders, suddenly you're on Brando's side. He's just so charismatic in that shot, let alone the fact that after that initial crawl of the warning, the censors demanded that Brando do uh, a spoken disclaimer at the top of the film, which he did, and he didn't want to do it. Just a little bit of a backtrack is that the idea of this film, they were saying that you're going to see something that's happening in a town. It's so wild. This could never happen in any other town. This just happened to happen here, and it could never happen again. Well, Brando and the producers believed quite the opposite. This was based on a motorcycle riot in the town of Hollister, California, in the Monterey Peninsula. They went up there to do their research, and they met up with these outlaw motorcycle gangs that had started to show up on the American highways after World War II. And they spoke with these guys, and these guys said, "Yeah, man, we treed that town, and that could happen anyway. That could happen tomorrow, you know." And Kramer said, "Well, what are you guys rebelling against?" And one guy in the crowd said, "Well, what do you got?"
Right.
Brando wrote that down and used that in the film. But Brando did his disclaimer and did not want to read that disclaimer. So he did it in a lisping, kind of funny voice. He said, "I don't know, it's me." Well, that voice, little lisping, etc., he kept that through the whole film. Brando was 28 years old, and in the film, he was basically playing, a teenage juvenile delinquent, very different than the films that he had done previously. And so right away you have a character that you are rooting for immediately because you love this guy. Men would love him, women would love him just based on that opening. However 58 seconds or however long they held on that shot of Brando just riding in front of the screen, and you immediately had a new kind of leading man, a new kind of Hollywood leading man. This wasn't John. They wouldn't put John Wayne up there or Gary Cooper or Randolph Scott. No, this was an entirely new kind of leading man that would follow in Brando's path from Elvis Presley to James Dean to you look at today, Timothy Chalamet.
Mm-hmm. How is the kind of acting that he did in this movie emblematic of where he was taking that art form, Burt?
Do you want something?
Yeah. I'd like a bottle of beer.
Beer's just in the bar.
Oh, all righty.
Brando's acting in this film was very similar to what he did in most films, which was he would take a character, a stock sort of character, whether he's playing the spy in Moritori to whether he's playing Fletcher Christian in Mutiny on the Bounty. He's playing a character that usually is a macho brute, a confident, strong leading man. Brando always brought in this self-doubt, this bisexual charisma, somebody called it. He wasn't mucho macho. He may have looked it, but he was always he brought a sensitivity to his roles that he thought that he wanted to be real. He wanted to bring a realism to a role, and that's something that hadn't been done before, really. I mean, people read their lines. They read them well. Clark Gable read his lines. He read them well. Humphrey Bogart read his lines. Brando didn't read his lines. He said, I don't see the lines. Put them up on a cue card or put them into my ear later in his career. Not because he was lazy. He was lazy. Yes, he showed a lot of laziness in his life, but this was a deliberate technique that he used because when someone says something to you, you don't answer right away, with that line that you should have said. You stop for a moment and you think, and then it comes out. And that's what Brando did in his roles, and that came out in everything he did. And so his leader of this motorcycle gang in The Wild One was very different than you might expect, especially when contrasted with Lee Marvin. When Lee Marvin shows up as the leader of the rival gang, who was much more in tune to what the actual outlaw bikers were like.
Hmm. I, I was wondering, this is a random question, but there, at the end of the movie, Johnny's being sort of dressed down by the county sheriff, and the county sheriff's like, I don't understand your whole act. Like, I don't know what you believe in, and I don't think you even know. And I kind of had this moment where, like, that guy's doing like a very kind of old school read the lines form of acting, and Brando's just kind of sitting in the chair giving him absolutely nothing, but giving the camera a lot. You're watching, you're seeing like how little respect or investment this guy has. And that led me to wonder, like, did Brando's co-stars ever feel, were they ever rubbed the wrong way by his like kind of style of acting?
From the very beginning, they were from his first hit on Broadway, uh, when he was in A Streetcar Named Desire. He was acting with the actress Jessica Tandy, and she was the star of the film. If you look, a star of the play. If you look at the early reviews of the play, they all focused on her. They said Jessica Tandy, she plays Blanche Dubois, etc. They mentioned Brando. Some of the reviewers mentioned Brando, but it was her play. Well, Brando was acting very differently on stage. He brought something to the stage which culminated in that performance, where he said he wanted to act as if he was an actual person. So he mumbled some lines. If he had an itch, he'd scratch it. If he had to blow his nose, he'd blow his nose on the stage. And he had different line readings. Add that to the point where he's playing the brutal rapist, Stanley Kowalski, and he's wearing this tight T-shirt, deliberately made a size too small. His pants deliberately a size too small, so everybody could see the bulges in his pants. He's bringing this raw animal, vigor to this play. And the director, Elia Kazan, said, I don't know, he's supposed to be the bad guy. And the audience is laughing at his lines. They're following. What do I do? Do I tell him to act worse? I can't. And Jessica Tandy hated it because he threw her off. And every play, he would do something different. And she wasn't used to that. By the time he did The Wild One, he had Lee Marvin, who actually also would celebrate his 100th birthday this year.
Oh,
Marvin,
great.
was a World War II vet. He was a tough guy. He was a drunk, and he hung out with the extras on the set and made fun of Brando and had a little fun because he thought Brando was a bit too much of a sissy, and the extras who portrayed Lee Marvin's motorcycle gang made fun of Brando's motorcycle gang because they all wore little black leather jackets and their rolled up jeans, while Chino's group, they looked like what the motorcycle outlaw motorcyclists were and would become, wearing raccoon skin caps and kilts and army surplus clothes and holding bottles and shit. So they were quite different, and the acting styles did clash for sure on the set.
This movie really, I would argue, maybe one of its best qualities as a movie is just the building sense of dread, that that one way or another something bad is going to happen here. I just love kind of the blocking in like the scenes in the cafe where there's just too many people in the cafe at all times. There's just like, there shouldn't be this many people in the shot. It's making me uncomfortable. Yeah. It's like a very classic old school filmmaking way of making the audience nervous. What do you think is the movie's best move in terms of building dread?
Well, there's always the fact that they're ready to leave. They were in the town. They weren't happy there. Let's get out of here. No, wait a minute. Crazy broke his ankle. We have to wait till the doctor takes care of Crazy. Okay. Now let's get out of here. Oh, wait a minute. They bring Crazy in. They ride him into the bar on a motorcycle. Okay, let's drink some more. Then Brando speaks to Kathy, the waitress that he's sort of flirting with, finds out that her father is the town policeman, and we're getting out of here. And it's like, all right, we're leaving. And then, oh wait, now Chino's here. And then the next thing, so every time he's ready to get out, he doesn't. Because again, this movie was supposed to was supposed to address social issues. One of them was the issue of World War II veterans who came back from the war, had seen terrible things in Europe that they couldn't talk about. You know, the silent generation, this greatest generation. They wouldn't talk about these traumatic things that they witnessed. Um, and they couldn't fit back into the white picket fence society. They couldn't fit back into what was the Eisenhower years that were beginning. So what did they do? They got on Harley Davidsons that were being produced again in the States that they were riding in Europe. And they got together in gangs and took to the road. Now, a lot of them were weekend warriors. They had to get back to work. A matter of fact, there's a slight mention of that in the Wild One, that, yeah, we do this and then we go back to work during the week and then we meet on the weekends. Um, but there was also the issue at the same time of juvenile delinquency. After World War II, kids were growing up too fast. Their mothers were in factories, their fathers were away. And there was great concern from community groups and later in Congress of juvenile delinquency. So this film was going to address both issues. So here you have Brando, 28 years old, basically playing a 15-year-old juvenile delinquent who's afraid to
Yeah.
go, which is really the way he came off in that.
Hmm.
He cries in the film. I mean, leading men don't cry. He took a little time to cry. He cried in some of his other films too, which apparently was a monumental, change in what this guy's weeping. And he wept in his first film, The Men, because he couldn't. He was a paraplegic war veteran, couldn't satisfy his fiancee, couldn't, wouldn't walk again, didn't know if he wanted to live, and he has his weepy moment in in the Wild One. Not as bad as not as bad as James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, where he's, you're killing me, and really a baby. But that's what Brando ushered in, this new sort of, adolescent leading man.
Was that just him sort of taking this role? Was it looked at as odd or a risk? I mean, he just played Mark Antony. He just played Zapata. He's like he's taking on these kind of titanic historical leaders, and then here he's gonna play as you say, a blown up 15-year-old.
Well, that was the thing. His first four films were quite different, quite groundbreaking. For his remake as a film of A Streetcar Named Desire, Viva Zapata, and then as the Mumbler playing Shakespeare, which he,
Right.
he did really well. Academy Award nominations for Best Actor for all three of those films. The film he did after this was On the Waterfront, where he finally won his Academy Award for Best Actor. But this wasn't seen as like, oh, Brando's making a B picture. No, Stanley Kramer was a very respected independent producer who made respected, socially conscious films, and this was going to be one of them. And when the film was released, they released it a bit early. They released it on Christmas Day in Los Angeles in 1953, so it could qualify for Academy Award nominations. The reviews came out and said, Brando's performance is great, but this is a tough movie. This is a movie with a lot of wildness and rebellion, and this could cause kids to, gang members to tear up the movie theaters. And so when it opened in New York City, the New York Times reviewer mentioned that this is a shame that this film is being basically snuck in. It's not getting full page ads in the Daily News and the Times. People were a bit afraid of the film when it came out because it had the reputation even before it was released.
And I'm curious about everything that the censors were worried about. Everything the country of England was worried about that kept the movie out for 15 years, that this would inspire hooliganism. It's sort of interesting in retrospect because like the gang itself, I would say that those guys are they do seem very juvenile. They're, if anything, just kind of annoying. They just like bop around and make motorcycle sounds and are sycophantic toward Johnny.
They're on pogo sticks.
Yeah. Other than the fact that they are on dangerous machines, they're not like explicitly threatening. If we can put ourselves like back in that mindset, was it just the mere depiction that if like 30 dudes on bikes came to a town, this could happen and it would be hard to stop? Because I guess I don't, other than Brando is very glamorous, but the gang itself, when I don't quite click with like, what was the concern?
This was an issue. There were, very publicized gang incidents. The one in the UK happened about maybe about 6 months before the movie opened. It was on Clapham Common, and gang members chased a kid from this park into the street and stabbed him to death in front of people going by on a double-decker bus, and they got to witness this, etc.
Mm.
There was another famous incident where two kids were robbing a confectionery factory, and one of the kids was slightly mentally impaired, and he had a gun, and the other kid had a gun, and the police said, give me the gun. And the kid said, well, let him have it. He shot him. And
Mm.
so the kid that said, let him have it, wound up being executed for the
Mm.
murder of this cop. And they say, well, he meant let him have the gun. They made a film about it. Uh, I think it was called Let Him Have It. I'm not sure. It was a UK film about it. And that caused
Wow.
great, great consternation in Parliament and in all the papers, et cetera. So all these things were in the headlines when this movie came out. And when the British censors saw this, they said, this movie is depicting the same kind of stuff that just happened here. We can't let kids see this.
Sure.
And that happened in Canada. It happened in parts of Europe, and most famously in Memphis, Tennessee, where
Mm.
a young guy just got out of high school named Elvis Presley had to go across the Mississippi River to see the film in West Memphis, Arkansas, and Brando became his idol. And that's who Elvis Presley wanted to be, as we found out in the
Right.
book.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I want to stay with the movie for a second. There's not. I just watched Easy Rider last night for the next episode, and relatively just based on the structure of the Wild One, there's not a lot of like open roading. You don't get to feel the freedom that supposedly drives these guys. What do you feel like the bikes represent in the Wild One, Burt?
Well, I think it all goes back to the way Roger Corman sold his first real biker picture to AIP to American International Productions in 1966. He had an idea for a film called Wild Angels. And this just as the Wild One was based basically on an image and a feature in Life magazine about that original motorcycle riot, Roger Corman saw an image of a Hell's Angels funeral in Life magazine. And he said, I want to make a movie about this. It's basically a Western, but instead of horses, we have motorcycles. And that's sort of what, without speaking it, without saying it, that's what the Wild One was.
Totally.
As a matter of fact, the head of the head of Columbia Pictures, uh, in cutting back the budget, refused to let them shoot on location. So they shot on a Wild West set on the Columbia Ranch. So that's why the streets are not paved and everything, and you see that everybody
Right.
got a portrait at hitching posts and stuff. So they actually shot this on a Wild West set. So sort of the motorcyclist became the new cowboy, and it was the cowboy of our motor age.
I have a random question. The hat that he wears. What did you call it? An eight-sided mariner's
It's an
cap?
it's an 8-panel mariner's cap.
An 8-panel mariner's cap. I don't think of Brando as a big hat guy across his career. Does he have other iconic hats? Is there anything else in the running?
Well, of course, he played Napoleon Bonaparte in
Yeah,
Desiree. There's a
that's
hat.
right. There
Uh,
you go.
there was always a matching hat to his suit in Guys and Dolls when he played Sky Masterson. Don Corleone, of course, had the fedora. And we can't forget, we can't leave out the island of Dr. Moreau, where
I was hoping you'd bring that up.
he wears an ice bucket hat as, as,
Right.
as well as the other hats that he wore. So Brando made use of those kind of props when he had to. Yeah.
There we go. That was that I perfectly answered. So do you feel like the fact that some of the messaging or a lot of the messaging that Kramer and Brando intended, the fact that that's sanded off the movie, do you feel like in the end, does that make it less interesting, or does it create an ambiguity that makes, say, analyzing the movie in the way you did more interesting?
When you talk about director's cuts nowadays, it would have been great to see the uncensored version to see if what Brando wanted. I mean, Brando was so disappointed in this film. His sister, uh, uh, Jocelyn, was on the set with him and said that's when he started to overeat. That's when he started, pounding away on the cakes, etc., because he was so depressed at what was going on with this film. Uh, when he left, he said, "I'm not going to make any movies anymore. I'm going to do one more play, and I'm going to go to Europe. I can't take Hollywood. They pull the guts out of what you want to do." He was so disappointed. He moved on, and then when you saw when he saw the reaction to the film, he'd already moved on. He really distanced himself from it. He was like, "Look, yes, they say this caused a revolution, and a teen revolution, a youth revolution, a rock and roll revolution, but yeah, we just happened to be in the right place at the right time. What we wanted to do wasn't done." So he moved on, and it would have been good to see what he wanted to add to it, because a lot of what they felt was important, the understanding. I mean, the critics at the time were like, we like the movie, but we don't understand, because it seems that the townspeople are just as violent as this gang, and who's to blame, and and so they never really were able to make it clear, kind of left it up to interpretation. Brando wanted that. He wanted this film to show that the so-called straight society was a reason there was a reason these guys rebelled, and that was taken out of the film.
It's crazy, isn't it? You're afraid of me. I don't know why, but I'm not afraid of you now. You're afraid of me.
I'm afraid of you. Are you cracked? Come on, get off.
The scene that you referenced earlier where Kathy and Johnny do go to their little potential hookup spot, maybe the only unintentional good byproduct is like, it just leaves a ton of meat on the bone for the performers, where you're like, what are these people feeling? Like, what's going on inside them? Whereas if there was more exposition about, like, you don't understand the things that I've seen in the war,
Right.
I think it maybe unintentionally leaves some more meat on the bone for the actors. Do you buy that at all?
Well, it did, and at the same time, there was a lot of meat left off the bone with his relationship with Chino.
Yes.
And again, in the years to come, there's been what's known as the queer reading of this film. It's become, just because of the way Brando was dressed, and the fact that that leather image became the image of the artist Tom of Finland, which replaced the stereotypical image of the homosexual. Before that, it was the mincing, effeminate, quote, fairy type. You know, when this artist Tom of Finland was doing his work in the 1940s, he was drawing pictures of men. He was a gay artist, and he was secretly drawing these very sexualized pictures of men, but they were very beautiful and very soft. When he saw the Wild One, everything changed, and he drew pictures of cops and men in leather jackets and tight bulging jeans, all based on the Wild. This all came from the Wild One. It was always there. The relationship between Brando's character and Lee Marvin's character, when I saw the film, watched it again after how many years I had seen it, to me it wasn't subtext. It was all right there. I mean, when Johnny, I missed you. I love you, Johnny. I love you, Johnny. And what's more explicit than, I love you. I miss you. I've been trying to find you. Let's wrestle.
Hiya, sweetheart. Hey, what are you doing in this miserable gully, Johnny Malone? I love you, Johnny. I've been looking for you in every ditch from Fresno to here, hoping you was dead.
Chino's giving him the needle, and your boyfriend don't go for that.
You've been having yourself a time, huh, Johnny? You do look pale. You been taking care of yourself? You've been staying out too late at night.
That's mine, Chino. Take it off.
And then Brando punches Lee Marvin, and Lee Marvin goes sprawling through the window of the millinery shop between mannequins of a bride and a groom. And then
Yep.
when he gets up, the bride's not there. These are things that seem to be, you take it for what it is, but it's there on the screen, and the words are there. And the critics of the time said, it's too bad, because there seemed to be a lot more passion between Brando and Lee Marvin than Brando and Mary Murphy as Kathy. She was a little bit boring. We would have liked to see more of the relationship between those two guys.
And you write about this in the book, but that reading of the Johnny Chino relationship continues to unlock what's going on in the Johnny Kathy relationship, where she's like, do you want to fight? Would it be better if we fought? And she's referring to the previous scene, but
Yeah.
I didn't totally clock that until you wrote about it in the book, and it kind of, everything starts to fall into place when you look at it that way. You already mentioned that by the time the movie came out and the impact was started to be felt culturally, that Brando had moved on. But I want to ask more broadly, when Elvis and James Dean, two people who worship Brando, and then, eventually Warhol and all these people who kind of turn the Wild One imagery into pop culture rocket fuel. What does Brando make of his influence in general? Do we know?
Brando really looked down upon acting. He didn't think it was important. He thought everybody acts, everybody lies. That's all acting is lying. He was far more interested in activism and far more interested in doing films that had a message. Either he was making a film because he needed the money to pay for, his latest, his divorce or whatever custody battles were going on, or he was trying to make a film that meant something. He he disassociated himself from it. When Elia Kazan made the film East of Eden, he hired James Dean, and he said to Brando, you got to meet this kid. This kid reminds me of you, and this kid worships you. Well, James Dean was like a puppy dog around Marlon Brando, and followed him around and really annoyed him. And it turned out that Brando came to the conclusion. He goes, he wasn't in love with me. He was in love with my character from The Wild One. I mean, he'd got a motorcycle. He wore a leather jacket. He mumbled. He thought, I'm not that character. I moved on, but by this time, Brando was working with Frank Sinatra doing Guys and Dolls. He was moving on from this, and at one point he said he told James Dean, "Look, you've got to be yourself. I think you should see an analyst. I think you should see a psychiatrist to get some help, and you have time." He thought that James Dean would have time to come into his own, which of course he did not, and he became the martyr. But you have to look also at The Wild One came out, and then about a year and a half later, you had Blackboard Jungle, which was far more violent and far more visceral than The Wild One. And you had Rebel Without a Cause. That was Dean's, I think it was his first posthumous picture. They both came out about a year and a half later. Some people say that Blackboard Jungle really kicked off the rock and roll revolution because it had at the very beginning of the film, it had its own disclaimer with a sort of a military drum tattoo, which turned into the opening of Rock Around the Clock. And the song Rock Around the Clock played over the credits. And they said that's when kids in the theaters jumped up, danced in the aisles, and tore the seats up. Everything they worried about was going to happen in The Wild One happened during Blackboard Jungle. But then again, there was never any rock and roll in the film after that opening. There was no rock and roll in Rebel Without a Cause at all. Everything was still jazz the way it was in the 50s.
Burt, before I get you out of here, we've got a segment on this show called Truth or Trivia, where the guest gets to choose whether they would like to do a little bit of trivia related to the film or whether they would like to try and answer a movie question as truthfully as possible. So I put the question to you, Burt. Truth or trivia?
Let's go for trivia.
I think you're going to crush this. But Robert Keith, who plays the cop, Bleecker, in the movie, stars with Brando in another film. Do you know it?
Yes, I just saw it. I'm stumped. Sorry. Tell me what it is.
No problem. It's Guys and Dolls. He again plays a cop.
Oh, he's a cop in Guys and Dolls. Okay, there you go.
Yep, there it is.
I was thinking black and white films.
The truth question I had, I'm going to force you to do it anyway. It's not an especially difficult one.
All right, let's see.
The 60s are generally considered kind of a lost decade for Brando, right? I mean, his legend roars back to life in the 70s with Godfather, Apocalypse Now, Last Tango in Paris. But I'm curious, if you had to pick a 60s movie of his that you would recommend to folks, what would you pick?
Here's the thing. I was not. I'm not a cinema expert, a film expert. I'm a journalist, pop culture journalist, etc. So I was discovering a lot when it came to Marlon Brando, and watched all his films in the 1960s, and was amazed at how he never phoned it in. on any of these films, and some of them were really great. Mutiny on the Bounty. I would say the greatest work he did at the end of the 60s was a film called Queimada, also known as Burn.
Hmm. I don't know this one.
Burn is probably, in his estimation, it was the best acting he ever did. And in the estimation of many others, it's set in the 1850s. He plays a British uh, agent who was sent to the Caribbean to stir up a slave revolt in a Portuguese colony so they could take over the sugar trade, based on the real work of William Walker, who started the revolutions in Nicaragua. This is a film that was directed by Guillo Pontecorva, who had directed a film called The Battle of Algiers, which was a tremendous, almost documentary type war film. That's worth checking out on its own. Brando starred in this film. He wanted, by this point, Brando was known as an activist in the 60s. He marched with Martin Luther King. He was standing behind Dr. King when he did his I Have a Dream speech on the Lincoln Memorial. He wanted to find a connection between what was going on in the 1850s and what was happening in the 1960s at a time of, the summer of riots, et cetera. And he started hanging out with the Black Panthers. And he started showing up at trials and funerals for the Black Panthers because he wanted to connect the two. And they changed the name of the film from Queimada to Burn, which was based on something that a DJ named Magnificent Montague had said during the riots: "Burn, baby, burn." And so we tried to make that connection there. The film is out there; you can see it online, and it's a great performance and I think one of Brando's most unheralded. But I have to add one more from the 60s,
Do it.
1964. Okay. This is one that it's often derided. It's called Bedtime Story,
I don't know this one either.
co-written by Paul Henning. Paul Henning, I believe, invented the Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres, so you can't go wrong there.
Uh-huh.
Brando plays an army corporal stationed in Europe who's he's a con man, and he's able to make it with women by going up to their houses and saying, "Oh, my grandmother used to live here," and he used to con all these women. He gets himself out of the army. He's on a train, and he meets this milquetoast guy on the train, played by David Niven, who turns out to be a con man on the French Riviera, who masquerades as a prince and is able to con women out of love and jewelry and money, etc. Well, these two guys team up on the Riviera. They become rivals. They fight. Brando is doing a comedic role that is on par with Jerry Lewis. He does wild Jerry Lewis comedy in this. The critics at the time said, "Brando has surprised us. He's really funny. This is great." Well, 12 years later, they remake the film as Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. Uh, Michael Caine is in the David Niven part, and Steve Martin is in the Brando part. And I first watched Bedtime Story. Then I watched Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. Then I went back and cut between the two of them. And the film, some of the scenes are almost word for word. Steve Martin is doing Brando's role. He's doing what Brando did, but people had forgotten by the 1980s. People had forgotten about this. He's doing Brando's role, and I'll tell you, the Brando version is timeless. You can watch it today and laugh. The Steve Martin thing is stuck in the 80s. He's doing jokes about the TV show Dance Fever, and there's bathroom humor, and Steve Martin gets to do his Steve Martin shtick. But it's quite unbelievable. You see a film, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, that has gone down as one of the favorite comedies that are out there, and you have this forgotten Brando picture that was the basis for it, and a performance that Steve Martin did his version of Marlon Brando. So I would recommend Bedtime Story. It's a surprise.
Great Rex. Thank you. I'm gonna ask every guest on this series, this new movie that's coming out, The Bikeriders. Burt, is this a movie that you have heard of at all? And parenthetically, are you surprised or pleased at all that we're still getting outlaw biker pictures in 2024?
Well, this wasn't on my radar at the time I handed in the book. It takes a while for the book to come out, and then I hear about it,
Yeah,
and here you've got Austin Butler, who's still channeling Elvis,
totally.
is saying that Tom Hardy, who is the star of this film, is definitely channeling Marlon Brando in The Wild One. He's basically doing Marlon Brando in The Wild One. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Also, it's amazing that you've got Billy Zane, who we remember from Titanic, is playing Brando in a new film called, I think it's called Brando in Tahiti. It's about Brando in Tahiti. Looks just like him. And then I saw yesterday that it's either a film or a mini series on one of the streaming networks where Matt Dillon is playing Brando in Last Tango in Paris.
I saw
they're doing a
this,
story
yeah.
about the making of Last Tango. And it's funny because in the book, I had spoken to Gray Fredrickson, who was a friend of mine. He died while I was still doing the research. And I was talking to Gray. Gray had won the Academy Award for producing Godfather Part Two. He worked with Brando on Candy. He produced Apocalypse Now, and he worked with Coppola on The Outsiders. And I said, you worked in The Outsiders, all these young actors, Tom Cruise, C. Thomas Howell, et cetera. Were any of these guys, influenced by Brando? He said, yeah, Matt Dillon. Matt Dillon was, Francis would say, look, there he goes again. He's doing Brando. Look at him. And now he's actually doing Brando in this film 40
How
years
about that?
later.
Comes by the inspiration, honestly. It's still going on.
Yeah.
Well, Burt, I thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you want to direct people to on your way out the door? I genuinely really liked the book. I mean, I recommend it as there's no shortage of information. It's wonderful, but you also just have this opportunity to cut to the chase in terms of what Brando meant then and now in a way that's like super accessible and a great read for 2024.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, people can go to marlonbrandobook.com where you get signed copies of the book, and also always adding information and things on that site. And then in October, I've got the book Shemp. The book is called Shemp, the biography of the Three Stooges, Shemp Howard, the face of film comedy. So I'll be around this year.
Well, Burt, thank you again. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.